All right, see ya.
All right, time to start the next set of tracks. I'd just like to give a big thanks to Maddie and Zoya and everyone else putting this together. I think this is hugely important, and it's great that we have something like this, and hopefully this is the first of many critical proximities to come. So I am Patrick Klepek. I am the senior news editor over at Giant Bomb, a website where a bunch of white dudes write and talk about games. We're very unique on the internet in that regard. 2 years ago, I was just the news editor, and then CBS bought us, gave me no additional resources, but told me I was the senior news editor. It makes me sound important, so I took the title and ran. My talk is labeled on the website, Pushing Big Sites to Have a More Critical Eye. It's a terrible title. It's really bad, but I didn't think it would get accepted, so I apologize and came up with a new one, which is called Bridging the Critical Gap. I think we can tackle both ideas, and it sounds a lot snappier. It's really easy to be cynical about the power, influence, and privilege wielded by the biggest video game websites, and I think it's mostly earned. Giant Bomb is not big as IGN or GameSpot, but it's certainly part of the established gaming entrenchment. It's a website made up of people who have been privileged enough to be talking and thinking about games for more than 2 decades. Video game media sites have an incestuous relationship with one another, often looking like a revolving door of the same names. Many in this room have good reason to be cynical about those hiring practices, and I say that as someone who has benefited from that very practice. Agreement is boring. Disagreement's way interesting. When a new game comes out, I'm way more interested in the one guy who hates it than the 100 people who fell in love with it. And there's none of that disagreement on the big sites. And it's not because they're bad people, it's because they're similar people. The reason such a divergence between the establishment publications and the critical circles that many of us follow is because those circles have voices with various backgrounds. They're approaching games from new directions, and that's not happening so much on the bigger sites. The critical question is whether big has to be bad. I don't think it's a choice between being bad but big and good but small. Video games are an extremely popular medium. It also means there's some extremely popular video game websites. Here's what the web analytics website Alexa tells us about sites in 2014. So we think about IGN, GameSpot, and Kotaku being kind of like the biggest of the big. IGN is the 367th biggest site in the world, 217 in the US. GameSpot, 973 in the world, 491 in the US. Kotaku, 1,494th in the world, 671 in the US, and Giant Bomb's like 4,458. But that's not, don't worry about that. Now, I don't, a lot of these sites do good and interesting work. I'm going to paint with a broad brush because that's kind of the only thing I can do in 10 minutes. There are great critics and great writers that have done interesting things at these places, so this criticism comes from a place of love. These are big numbers. Millions of people who play games are visiting these websites, and these writers, reporters, and critics there are influencing how these people then think about games and talk to other people about them. It's a job to take seriously, and it can be easy to forget that. It's important to challenge your ideas as much as it is to challenge those of your readers. And if we look at that list, it's pretty sobering because you don't see things like critical distance, you don't see things like medium difficulty, you don't see things like nightmare mode or the border house. All 3 of those sites, 4 sites, and the many more have done way more to influence my thinking on games than any of those big popular sites. But I'm paid to think about games. It's a privileged position. I seek out analytical, reflective criticism to try and challenge myself. That's not your average player, but that doesn't mean there aren't a great many on those websites looking to be intellectually challenged. It means that most of the big sites aren't spending much time truly challenging them. If a reader hasn't been exposed to it, then how can they know they want it? This applies as much to a new game idea as it does to criticism. And it's easy to beat up on the big sites because they're big, have enormous sets of resources, and they don't seem to use them very well, which kind of sounds like our general critique of AAA games. They can make it awfully easy to lose sight of what actually is happening in some of these places that is progress. So, BioShock Infinite. I'm going to guess it's a game that most people in an audience like this didn't care for very much. But it was a game that, when launched, received basically universal acclaim from the press. And it was followed by a deep, sustained critical backlash. This cycle is not uncommon with big games. It is reflective of an ingrained approach to reviewing and, perhaps more importantly, systemic and long-held hiring practices. When GameSpot's site relaunched last fall, it published a re-review of BioShock Infinite. And the original review was a 9, while the re-review was a 4. The re-review had this quote: Infinite avoids taking a stance on a situation that it constructs, instead diverting its attention to a pair of characters who encompass tired stereotypes, merciless killer, gifted damsel, that have no relation to the thematic elements set up at the outset. With nothing of value worth exploring, Infinite quickly devolves into a mindless shooter buoyed only by its stunning artistic design. That sounds a little bit closer to what I was hearing in critical circles. I'm not necessarily suggesting that one is right or wrong, although maybe I would. That's besides the point. What I'm saying is that almost no review of BioShock Infinite in a major gaming site was majorly divergent from the popular opinion. While the second GameSpot review came after the game's launch, it reflects an alternative but relevant line of criticism on a major game site that was uncommon in any other major review at launch. Remember, GameSpot's 973rd in the world. Being 973rd means you hold influence, and the bigger you are, the more you should be thinking about how that influence is used. We're seeing some impacts of this diversity elsewhere, too, that should be taken as signs of progress. Keza McDonald, a former IGN editor who often spoke about sex and gender issues on that site, will soon be the head of Kotaku UK. She's moving from the editor of one big site to the head of another. Polygon recently published a review of Danganronpa, a visual novel for the Vita with a plot twist involving a character's true gender being discovered by the player. In the review, there's a sidebar about this point by the reviewer. While working on this review, I consulted an expert on gender and sexuality to discuss the character's representation at some length. With help, I reached the conclusion that I didn't have enough information to comprehend or understand the character's preferred identity. However, Danganronpa's handling of the situation remains troubling. 5 years ago, we could not expect that something like this would be on a website. This prompted a healthy dialogue in the comments section. Yes, the comments section. And I raised a similar issue in my review of Danganronpa on Giant Bomb, but was mostly criticized for having an agenda. We're seeing more of these voices with megaphones raising these issues that we wouldn't have heard about before, and we have to look at these as signs of progress. It's also maybe not a surprise that a critic would shy away from this. And it's worth remembering what comes from working for a website with millions and millions of people. When Carolyn Pettit reviewed Grand Theft Auto V for GameSpot and had the audacity to criticize the game's portrayal of women, the review turned into a storm of critical commentary about Pettit's gender. It was insulting, it was ridiculous, but the reason this kind of commentary happens is both a result of technology meant to amplify voices without tools tailored for the consequences, and because we've created a critical culture that is not used to hearing these ideas. Ideas are scary when we hear them for the first time. We tend to reject them. On sites like IGN, GameSpot, Kotaku, or Giant Bomb, the demographics skew younger, especially among commenters. This might be the first time they're hearing this kind of criticism. Ignorance isn't an excuse, but we're all ignorant until we've been told otherwise. These are two examples of people who have reached out and said that, you know, what I've talked about in articles, or reviews, or stories has influenced them and how they think going forward. I don't share them to pat myself on the back about how I've changed someone, but only to show the power of words and what we can do at some of these sites when we bring these issues to light. For some people, Giant Bomb is the only site they visit. This is true of IGN, Kotaku, Joystick. We cannot expect these people to come to us. Sometimes we have to go to them. But our culture only changes with a mixture of new voices questioning the old ones. There's not a lack of talent in games writing, there's a lack of mobility for new writers to move up. Places like Patreon are great, but it's not everything. It's not health insurance, it's not a 401k, it's not stability. Criticism is a form of creativity, and it's helped by stability. So what can we do? We can apply pressure both internally and externally. If you, like me, are a member of one of these websites, it's important to lobby for a more diverse staff. The hiring of yet another white dude is not inherently a bad thing, but make sure a conversation is happening to broaden the scope of applicants. We tend to hire those we know because it's easy, but that doesn't bring in new choices that challenge the old ideas, including your own. Giant Bomb is always looking to expand. But right now, if we can't afford to hire an editorial person, if your site can't afford to hire an editorial person, there are ways to use your platform, which is a privilege, to elevate those voices. It's why I featured Kara Ellison, Jen Frank, Zoe Quinn, and others on our morning show. Giant Bomb has a big, influential platform, and I can use that to elevate others. Having a platform is a privilege, and you need to give back to the audience, too. On the flip side, it's important that constant pressure and scrutiny is applied to these websites, including my own. It's easy to become complacent in a cushy job like mine, and complacency is only dislodged by an external push. When Ben Kuchera was hired by Polygon to be the head of their opinions section, there was a loud, sustained, and vocal reaction. People listened. I heard it. Even if it didn't change anything, maybe it will influence the next hire, Polygon or not. You might piss some people off, but if you're not pissing some people off, you're probably not trying hard enough. What I mean to suggest is that we shouldn't give up on some of these big sites. These big sites have a big reach and a big influence, and that will trickle down and benefit all of us. That means people need to have their feet held close to the fire, and no, I'm not excluding myself from that conversation either. Thanks.